Catherine rubbed her eyes tiredly, looking at the clock on the supermarket wall. There were still 3 hours left in her shift. Her hands were automatically pushing items through the checkout, and her mind was far away, thinking about the electricity bill that had come in the morning and the fact that her son Michael needed new sneakers for his gym class again. "Good afternoon," she smiled at the next customer, although her cheeks were already sore from smiling endlessly. It was not an easy job, but Catherine could not afford to pick and choose. At 38 years old, she was left alone with a 10-year-old son after Richard, her ex-husband, simply disappeared from their lives 3 years ago. No alimony, no support, just empty promises and silence on the phone. "Mom, I'm hungry," Michael's voice rang out when she finally crossed the threshold of their small rented apartment at 9 in the evening. "I'll make you something, dear." Catherine kissed the top of his head. "How are things at school?" Michael shrugged as he buried himself in his tablet, the only expensive thing she'd been able to buy him for last Christmas after saving for a whole year. "It was fine. Mrs. Watson said I'm top of the class in math." Catherine smiled as she took the leftovers from last night's dinner out of the fridge. Her son was a smart boy, and she was doing everything she could to give him a good education, even if it meant cutting back on everything else. "Reheated food again?" Michael asked, looking up from the screen. "I'll make something fresh tomorrow, I promise," Catherine replied, trying to hide the fatigue in her voice. She took an envelope with an electricity bill out of her bag and sat down at the kitchen table. 320 pounds. The amount made her heart sink. It was more than she had expected. After paying the rent and other obligatory payments, she had very little left over from her cashier's salary. "Mom, can I have some new sneakers?" Michael suddenly asked. "Tommy from class has these cool ones with LEDs," and Catherine felt a lump in her throat. "Let's talk about this later, okay? It's time for dinner." She set a plate of heated lasagna in front of her son and sat down next to him, mechanically going through the bills. Rent, electricity, gas, telephone, internet. The numbers danced before her eyes, adding up to a sum that seemed insurmountable. "Mom, why doesn't Dad help us?" Michael suddenly asked. Catherine froze. This question always took her by surprise, even though it wasn't the first time her son had asked it. "Your dad is going through a difficult time," she replied, trying to find the right words. "But you know I'm always there for him, right?" Michael nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes that broke her heart. She knew that her son missed his father, even though he had never been particularly attentive to him even when he lived with them. Late at night, after putting Michael to bed, Catherine sat in the kitchen with a cup of cheap tea. Tomorrow, back to work, back to smiling at customers, back to counting every penny. She looked at her wallet and saw that she had only 20 pounds left until her next paycheck in a week. She would have to save on everything again, even food. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Parker, their neighbor who sometimes looked after Michael. "Catherine, dear, I'm sorry to call you so late. I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to visit my daughter in Manchester next week. I won't be able to babysit Michael." That was another blow. Now I will have to ask for extra shifts at the supermarket to be able to be with my son after school. "Thanks for the heads up, Mrs. Parker," Catherine replied tiredly. "Good night." Catherine's workday was coming to an end. She looked at her watch. In 15 minutes her shift would be over, and she would be able to buy the essentials before the store closed. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to a man standing in line at the next checkout. He looked about 60 years old, maybe a little older. His graying hair was neatly combed and his suit was neat, though not new. However, something in his posture betrayed deep fatigue and anxiety. He was nervously sorting through the groceries in his basket: bread, milk, a few apples, canned food. The simplest things you buy for everyday use. The line was moving slowly. Catherine noticed the man looking at his watch from time to time, as if he was in a hurry. Finally, It was his turn. "That will be 23 pounds and 40 pence, the cashier announced. The man took out his bank card and swiped it through the terminal. An error message appeared on the screen. "I'm sorry. There seems to be something wrong with the card," he said quietly, trying to swipe it again. Another error. People in line began to show signs of impatience. "Do you have another card?" the cashier asked, trying to keep her tone professional. "No, this is the only one." The man started nervously checking his pockets. "I thought I had some cash." "Well, that's too much," came an irritated voice from the queue. "Some of us are in a hurry to get home." Catherine watched the man's face turn red with shame. His hands trembled as he tried to check his pockets again. "I'm sorry. I'll have to." He started to put the groceries away, and at that moment Catherine felt her legs carrying her to the checkout. "Wait," she said, coming closer. "I'll pay for it." The man looked at her in surprise. "What? No, it's okay." Catherine took the last 20 pounds out of her wallet. "Take the change," she said to the cashier. There was silence in the line. The cashier quickly punched through the rest of the items and handed over the change 3 pounds and 60 pence. The man stood there, unmoving, looking at Catherine as if he could not believe what was happening. "I don't know how to thank you," he finally said. "You have no idea how much this means to me." His voice trembled with emotion. In his eyes, Catherine saw something more than gratitude. There was relief, almost despair. "Give me your contacts. I'll definitely return the money," he began, trying to get his phone. "No need," Catherine replied gently. "Just help someone else when you have the chance." She noticed the man look carefully at her name tag before picking up his bags. His hands were still shaking. "Thank you, Catherine," he said quietly. "You don't even realize what you've done." With that, he quickly walked toward the exit, leaving Catherine standing at the checkout. The people in line now looked at her differently, some with respect, some with surprise. As she walked back to her cash register, Catherine felt a strange sensation, a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. The 20 pounds were her last money before her paycheck, but she didn't regret her actions. Something in that man's eyes and his posture reminded her of her own hard times when it seemed like the whole world was against you. That evening she bought only half of what she had planned. She would have to make do with what was in the fridge for a few more days. Michael will certainly be disappointed that he won't be getting his favorite yogurt, but that's okay. They'll get over it. Catherine had just finished reading Michael a bedtime story. The boy slept soundly, clutching his favorite teddy bear. She quietly left the room, leaving the door ajar. Her son did not like complete darkness. "Mom," Michael mumbled sleepily. "Go to sleep, dear," Catherine whispered, returning to bed. "Tomorrow is an important day. You have a math test." "I know all the formulas," the boy mumbled, falling asleep. Catherine smiled and kissed her son on the forehead. The clock read 10:30. She planned to iron some more clothes and go over the bills. A typical evening for a single mother. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. 3 clear, confident knocks broke the silence of the apartment. Catherine froze. Who could it be at this hour? Mrs. Parker always called before she came to visit, and they never spoke to anyone else in the house. The knock came again, this time more insistently. "Who is it?" Catherine asked as she walked to the door. "Good evening, Miss Williams," a man's voice answered. "We need to speak with you." Catherine looked through the peephole. 2 men in dark suits stood on the landing. One was tall, slender, with gray hair on his temples. The other was younger, with a neat beard. Both looked like successful businessmen or lawyers. "What do you want?" she asked without opening the door. "It's about last night at the supermarket," the older one answered. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Davidson." Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. The supermarket. Had she done something wrong by helping that man? "I don't know what you mean," she replied, trying to sound confident. "Please, Miss Williams," the younger man said gently. "We just want to talk." It's important." Catherine hesitated, her eyes falling to the phone on the table by the door. In case of emergency, she could call the police. Finally, she slowly opened the door, leaving the security chain in place. "Let me see your documents," she demanded. The men produced their IDs without objection. The older one introduced himself as Robert Miller, the younger one as Peter Grant. Both were employees of Davidson Enterprises. "May I come in?" Miller asked. The conversation could be long. Catherine reluctantly took off her chain. The men entered her small living room where she had just been ironing clothes. She quickly put away the iron and the scattered clothes. "Sorry about the mess," she muttered. "No need to apologize," Grant replied with a slight smile. "We realize we came unannounced." Miller took a photo out of his briefcase and showed it to Catherine. It was the same elderly man from the supermarket, but he looked completely different. Confident, in an expensive suit, at the entrance to some office building. "Do you recognize this man?" Miller asked. "Yes," Catherine answered. "It's the man from the supermarket. What's wrong with him? Did something happen to him?" Grant and Miller looked at each other. "Mr. Davidson is looking for you," Grant said. "He wants to thank you personally for your kindness." "Thank me?" Catherine was relieved but also embarrassed. "It was only 20 pounds. It was much more than money to him," Miller replied. "You see, Mr. Davidson." Suddenly, Michael's voice came from the children's room. "Mom?" "It's okay, dear," Catherine replied. "Go back to sleep." She turned to the men. "Excuse me, but I don't understand. Why did you have to come so late? And how did you know my address?" "We apologize for the late visit," Miller said. "But the situation is delicate. Mr. Davidson has been very insistent about the urgency." Catherine felt anxiety grip her. Something about it all seemed strange, wrong. "And what exactly does he want?" she asked bluntly. "To talk to you," Grant replied. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, at the Bluebird Coffee House on Oak Street. He will be waiting for you there." "I'm working tomorrow," Catherine replied. "And anyway, this is all very strange. Mr. Davidson understands that," Miller said gently. "He's willing to compensate you for your time. And if it makes you feel more comfortable, you can bring a friend with you." Catherine looked at the photograph that was still in her hands. The man in it looked different. Not as confused and tired as he had looked in the supermarket. But it was definitely him. "What's all this for?" she asked. "It was just 20 pounds. "If he wants it back, believe me, it's not about the money," Grant interrupted. "Mr. Davidson will explain everything in person. He just wants to thank the person who helped him in his time of need." Catherine hesitated. It all seemed too strange, but at the same time she had a feeling that there was something more to it. "Okay," she finally said. "I will come." The men stood up. "Thank you for your time, Miss Williams," Miller said, handing her a business card. "If you have any questions, please call this number." After they left, Catherine stood by the window for a long time, watching them get into a black Mercedes and drive away. The business card in her hand seemed heavy, as if it contained some secret. The Bluebird coffee shop turned out to be a cozy place in the business district of the city. Catherine arrived 10 minutes early, nervously clutching her purse. She had called her work and taken the day off for the first time in a long time. "Good morning, Miss Williams," a familiar voice said. It was Robert Miller, who had visited her last night. "Please follow me." He led her to a private room in the back of the coffee shop. The same man from the supermarket was already sitting there, but he looked completely different now, confident, in an impeccable suit. "Catherine," he stood up to meet her. "Thank you for coming. I'm William Davidson." "Mr. Davidson?" Catherine felt her voice tremble. "I don't understand." "Please sit down," he gestured to a chair. "Robert, leave us alone." Miller nodded and walked out, leaving them alone. The waitress brought coffee and cakes. "You must be surprised," Davidson began, "and I can understand that. This whole situation looks strange. Why did you come looking for me?" Catherine asked bluntly. Because of the 20 pounds? Davidson shook his head. No, not because of the money, because of what you did, because of your kindness. He paused as if to collect his thoughts. You know, 30 years ago I was in a similar situation. Young, ambitious, but penniless. Once I couldn't even buy bread. And then a stranger helped me just like you helped me yesterday. Catherine listened intently, watching his face. But why were you in such a state yesterday? She asked. You're a successful businessman. A successful businessman? He smiled bitterly. Yes, that's true. But sometimes life throws up unpleasant surprises. 3 days ago, one of my partners tried to seize control of the company. He blocked all corporate accounts, including my personal cards. But that's illegal, Catherine exclaimed. Of course, Davidson nodded. And my lawyers have already solved this problem. But that evening I was exhausted after meeting with my lawyers. I hadn't eaten all day. I thought I would just buy something for dinner, and suddenly it turned out that I couldn't even pay for a can of canned food. He looked her straight in the eye. You know what impressed me the most? You didn't hesitate for a second. You just came over and helped, even though you don't live very well yourself, I see. Catherine felt herself blushing. It's normal to help people. Yes, Davidson agreed. But not everyone understands that. I watched you in the supermarket. I saw your badge, noticed how tired you were after your shift, and yet you gave your last money to a stranger. How do you know it was the last? Catherine wondered. Davidson smiled gently. I saw you counting the coins and then buying groceries for yourself, and how you put aside half of what you wanted to buy. Catherine looked down, embarrassed that someone had noticed her financial difficulties. Don't be embarrassed, Davidson said. I know what it's like to be on the edge. I know what it's like to count every penny. That's why what you did impressed me even more. He took an envelope out of his briefcase. Here is an invitation to dinner at my house next Saturday. I want to introduce you to someone who once helped me, just as you did yesterday. She became my first investor and then my friend. Catherine took the envelope with trembling hands. I don't know. This is all so sudden. I understand, Davidson nodded. But sometimes life gives us unexpected opportunities. That woman who helped me 30 years ago changed my life. Maybe it's time to return the favor. He stood up. Think about my invitation. You can bring your son with you if you want. I have a grandson his age. It will be interesting for them to meet. Catherine also stood up, still trying to process what she had heard. Mr. Davidson, just think about it, he interrupted her gently. And thank you again. You reminded me of something important that I had almost forgotten over the years, the power of simple human kindness. When Catherine left the coffee shop, her head was spinning from everything she had heard. She was still clutching the invitation that could change her life. But was she ready for such a change? Catherine stood by the window of her new office, watching the fall rain. It had been 3 months since she had met Mr. Davidson in the supermarket, and her life had changed beyond recognition. Mom, will you be back soon? Michael came into the study holding a new tablet. Mrs. Anderson said I could read here while you finish up. 15 more minutes, dear, Catherine smiled. Then we'll go to dinner. Michael settled down on the comfortable couch in the corner of the study. He often came to his mother's house after school now that her new work schedule allowed it. There were no more exhausting shifts at the supermarket, no more counting every penny until payday. Miss Williams, Lisa, her assistant, knocked on the door. The documents for tomorrow's meeting are ready, and Mr. Davidson wanted me to remind you about Saturday night's dinner. Catherine nodded, remembering the night she first stepped into the Davidson home. She had expected to see a luxurious mansion, but the house was cozy and homely. It was there that she met Mrs. Green, the very woman who had once helped the young Davidson. You know, Catherine, Mrs. Green said at the time, when I saw William 30 years ago, he reminded me of my son, just as ambitious, just as lost. I just couldn't pass him by. Now every Saturday they would get together. Davidson, Mrs. Green, Catherine, and Michael. These dinners became a new tradition, a place where they shared stories, dreams, and plans. Catherine returned to her desk, where her latest report lay. Her new position as head of the customer service department was exactly what she needed. She understood people. She knew how to find an approach to everyone, and her experience in the supermarket suddenly became a great advantage. "Mom, look!" Michael ran up to her, showing her something on his tablet. "I got the highest score on my math test." Catherine hugged her son. Now she had enough time to help him with his homework, go to parent-teacher conferences, and attend school events. She remembered her last day at the supermarket. Her co-workers threw her a farewell party, and she promised herself she would never forget what she had been through. Her first paycheck at her new job seemed like a fabulous amount of money. She could finally buy Michael the sneakers he had been dreaming of, pay all the bills, and even put some money aside for savings.